Welcome to this episode of Executive Tech Talks, the show where we talk to financial services executives about their technology tribulations and triumphs. Many thanks to ServiceNow, who is our exclusive sponsor for Series 2. Welcome back, Guus. And I know that for our next discussion, one of the questions that people always ask and raise is there's a natural tension between cybersecurity and digital customer experience. You know, the customer experience folks don't want to worry about cybersecurity because it gets in the way of that customer experience, and the cybersecurity folks want to always put barriers in the interaction with the customer in order to make things more secure. How do you balance that tension?
It's obviously something we live and breathe in the businesses we're in. But our goal is to provide good customer experiences, and keeping them safe is part of that experience. And so, yes, they tend to be in different organizations. And so there's definitely how do you get those groups together and make sure that we all share the same, not so much end goals, but the same values about what constitutes a good user experience, what constitutes best practice when it comes to cyber resiliency. It's really hard to emphasize how important those early conversations are. So for most organizations that are mature, that are stable, there is an enormous amount of system in place. And these conversations tend to happen when you make changes, when you have projects, when you drive initiatives. That's a beautiful time of conversation where maybe it's driven by cyber. We want to introduce a new control, and then digital will say, well, that control, we want to make that as intuitive as possible. Maybe let's say that a customer isn't allowed under certain conditions to do an action, right? In most large organizations, those verifications happen multiple times. So let's say there's 5 times. Before we display a button, when the user clicks a button, a few seconds after the button was clicked, an end of day badge, and maybe a reconciliation. And all of those have to be good before the action is executed. And your digital folks will say, well, we really have to hide the button because otherwise the customer will click on something then that isn't allowed, which is of course a legitimate call. But your resiliency folks might say, well, guess what happens if the decisioning to decide should we display the button takes a long time, long to be defined as in our web scale. If it's more than half a second, maybe that will slow down your whole page, and in particular if it goes beyond a second or so, it could start to have some side effects. And so then you have to have a conversation. How important is it to hide that button? Could we hide the button under 99% of the cases, or 99.9, or whatever, how many nights you want, but maybe display it sort of accidentally if the decision takes more than half a second? Sometimes the answer is absolutely not. There's no room here for discussion. That's legit, but in many cases you'll find, since we have the actual control in place in 4 other places, it's okay to maybe in those rare cases where there's a slowdown to decide to change and put a timeout or what have you. And that's then where the rubber meets the road. Do we optimize for the digital experience by not displaying the button? Or do we say we optimize for the resiliency of the website because we'd rather have the page even there if there's a button that shouldn't be there? And those discussions, that's really, it's about details, it's about small things, but you have to have all 3 players at the table. Right? You can't in isolation say yes or no. There's all sorts of viewpoints there, and obviously it very much depends on what the button was for in the first place. But how do you get those folks at the table? And so that, I think, becomes what I've seen in many cases, a conversation in your software development lifecycle early on, and really before you do your tech design. When you do your requirements, make sure those conversations happen. And I'll say it again. Those conversations won't happen if there isn't a culture of reliability, of resilience. If people aren't kind of aware of those conversations, because if you wait until the project is well underway, obviously then timelines and whatnot could become factors that interfere. So it goes back almost to making sure there's a culture in your organization that understands that those conversations need to happen and need to happen early on.
Well, it almost sounds like what you're saying is kind of, in a sense, threefold. One is that there needs to be this resilient culture, and as part of a resilient culture, you have communication between multiple parties and a recognition that priorities are going to be different for each group and that that's not wrong, but that the goal of the culture is to arrive at a sort of Venn diagram overlap between all those priorities so that we can have a fantastic digital customer experience and great security as much as possible. So thing one would be culture. It sounds like thing two, and this is a very interesting theme that's been sort of hidden in some of your discussions up till now, is this notion of granularity. So it's not, neither side gets to say, well, but you can't do this thing you want to do because it has one feature that conflicts with my goals. The question is, how can we address that one feature while maintaining the 95% of features that work great and are unobjectionable? So there's almost an element of diplomacy in this, that you aren't allowed to throw out somebody's idea just totally until you've really teased it down to the level of granularity that it needs. So there may be a component of their idea that has to be tossed, but the idea as a whole can stay. So that would be the second thing, which is that granularity. And the third thing that almost falls out of the granularity and the resilient culture is a willingness to prioritize. So which feature is most important to keep secure? Which feature cannot be sacrificed at any cost? Which feature is more of a nice to have, but we're willing to do some horse trading if the end goal comes out better? And it's kind of interesting that this theme keeps coming back again and again.
No, that's 100% right. And that's why I focus on shifting left, right? Having these conversations so early, because you're right, it does take time. There's diplomacy. It is about the details. Look, in our business, the lines are drawn pretty clearly, right? So when we talk about our objectives for digital experience or cyber, they're very clear. There's not a whole lot of room for any type of discussion, but there are subtle fine-grained items where we can tweak and gain a lot of ground when it comes to resiliency. And you're right, it takes a long time. So try to get them early on in your software development life cycle, so that you have the time, and you have the time for diplomacy, for working that out and getting into the details that deserves.
And I know that we engineers are not known for our diplomacy generally, but one of the interesting books I read on negotiation and diplomacy in general is one of the beautiful things about the fact that everyone comes at a problem with a different set of priorities and a different set of goals is something that may be essential to me, may be not that important for you. So you may be willing to sacrifice that as long as you get your essential needs met, and I may be able to do the same. And if we're both aware of that and we're willing to work together, that's how that resilient culture can get built.
Right, no, that's beautiful. Yeah.
So thank you very much. That was very insightful. Thanks for listening to this episode of Executive Tech Talks. And a special thanks to ServiceNow, who is our exclusive sponsor for Series 2.